Welcome to What Grows. It's a podcast where we play with the connection between who we are and how we grow. I'm your host, Noella Mashi. Bunmi, you have the rare ability to zoom out and see the 30,000-foot view of global change, and then zoom back in to ask, but what does this mean for a 20-year-old in Nigeria, or for a parent trying to raise a changemaker? You've spent your career translating big ideas into practical applications. And this includes measuring changemaker density across cities, building AI tools that enhance our collective intelligence, and creating networks that connect diaspora communities back to Africa. You're also the person I go to when I need to think bigger, because you help people see not just what they're doing, but why it matters in the bigger scheme of things. And you're just a genuinely lovely human who puts others first, listens deeply, and makes everyone around you feel like their ideas matter. So I'm really happy we get to do this, and welcome.
Thank you. I feel so seen and very honored. Thank you.
So my warm up question to ask is, if you could give your life a title, like it was a book, what would it be?
Figuring out a way. Honestly, I think it's a really good question, and I'm sure I have a better answer, under different conditions. But um, the summary of my life, I think, has been a lot of figuring out a way. Whatever the obstacle is, or problem, context, or even sometimes from a vision. What is it supposed to look like? Once we have decided that's what we're going to do, then we figure out a way to get there.
What are you figuring out a way through or for at the moment?
So, your introduction was very powerful because you yourself are extremely articulate, and that articulation seems like the first time I ever heard it. It's not, but it clarified again how I work and how I think. And to answer your question, I'm in a liminal space between on the ground where I was and in the 36,000 foot space where I've been in the last 6 years. And I'm trying to close the gap. Uh, to be more specific, this 36,000 foot view is me in Washington, D.C., at the seat of power of the world, where we are currently exporting chaos to the rest of the world right now. But I've had a fairly rare opportunity to see how the world actually works. Started with being in grad school, coming out of grad school, and not being prepared to go back to the real world, and getting a wonderful opportunity to study, well, to do political science research with a unit called Innovations for Successful Societies, run by Professor Jennifer Widener. And what Jennifer Widener would do is go into low middle income countries and look for people she called so policy entrepreneurs, right? People who are maybe bureaucrats or political leaders who are making real things happen. And she would document their case studies about how they did that, and how they made a real change. One case study was how Tinubu and Fashola completely revamped Lagos from an infrastructure perspective. A very, very interesting case study. And she would use very, you know, very technical, sort of anthropological and political science, like documentation to trace the history, trace the preconditions, trace exactly how it came to be. I also worked on one case about how Nigeria, which since the return of this current democracy in 1999, we hadn't had a health law until 2014. So that's when our Health Act actually came to life. And part of that Health Act said that 1% of all government revenues would go to primary health care. And as of 2019, Nigeria had not operationalized that. So you can see how from 1999 to 2019, there's nothing happening in real time at the sort of basic primary healthcare level. I mean, there's stuff happening, but the funding that's supposed to support it, etc. So the question of who are the people who made that law come to life, and then from that point, how were they? Who were the key actors that had to come together to essentially reach a place where this law is now operationalized and the funding is actually going where it's got to be? What was the cost of each individual that was doing that? Where were the sort of difficulties that they were enhancing? And so, this theme of figuring out a way, innovations for successful societies, was always looking at what Jennifer called development traps. Like we are, it doesn't matter what we do, the game is rigged against us. First off, development is us chasing the West and chasing the way it's supposed to be over there, not really stopping to think about what do we want in our lives? What is it supposed to look like? And but then there's all these traps. We elect our leaders democratically, but then they are powerless to do anything. And then when they come to the West to ask for money from the World Bank, maybe they want 400 million, they go back home with 50 million only and like 10,000 more conditions than they were, So now you're just stuck, and, if you come back with 50 million and you only have 2 years on the clock, you can't actually do very much. So there's this concept of the development trap. So that's where I'm coming from now, is like seeing all this and seeing how it actually works in reality. Um, and then making sense of my past experiences on the ground, trying to quote fix youth unemployment, which I thought was the biggest problem that we had. And you might remember I was working in low income neighborhoods, working with young people who didn't have those types of career path accesses and trying to help them, kind of make pathways. But then zooming all the way out and realizing, oh my gosh, there's a there's a broader sort of spectrum around us, and more importantly, there are preconditions. So one professor used to say, the present is a footnote of the past, meaning a whole book has already been written. What you're living right now is just a bunch of history that comes before. So I think coming to the US this time was my way of finally entering into that world and entering into why entrepreneurship is not going to fix the problems, or even electing new leaders is not quite going to fix the problem. And even if you got enough of that going, it wouldn't quite get there. So, what I'm figuring out today is what is the critical path to achieving our own goals and competing effectively in the world. And it is a question of competition because there are finite resources on Earth. And those finite resources are not distributed evenly at all. And if the finite resources run out, then some people will suffer than some other people. Or if there were disastrous events, some people will suffer more than some other people. So we are all competing to ensure that we have enough resources to take care of an eventuality like catastrophe or resources running out or so on and so forth, which is why we are all forced to sort of try to develop. So, what is the critical path to making sure Nigerians, Africans as a whole, who have been historically marginalized, can get on the same stage and compete effectively? Is what I am working at very strong now.
That is very interesting for many reasons. But I'll also just say when you said the word competition, my shoulders just tensed up. I was like, oh my gosh, we need to, it was honestly a little bit scary, but I completely see where you're coming from. One of the questions that I'm asking myself is, I mean, if we do have to exist in relationship with each other, which we do, whether you call it low middle income countries and like wealthier countries, whether you call it like different cultures need to exist in relationship with each other, there's kind of from my perspective a clear articulation of the downside of this for the oppressed or for the people whose resources are being taken from them and just like not evenly distributed. But I want to have a clearer sense of the cost of oppression, of the cost of winning the competition. What does kind of figuring out how to coexist on the same planet in relationship in that way look like in the context of this competition that you said is necessary?
Let me stop being philosophical and get grounded. To your point, we currently have national borders that create allegiances that are required or demanded of people. So that already forces you into an in group versus an out group. However, as I've come to learn since I moved to the US now 6 or 7 years ago, even within the US, there's a lot of in groups and out groups, whether it is low educated people in in Appalachia or in inner city Detroit. There are lots and lots of disparities, right? And which then themselves create socioeconomic or religious or racial in groups versus out groups. And I think that it is a human condition to tend towards survival with the idea of who's an in group and who's an out group. So let's zoom back out on this planet. And since we are organized by national identity, there's nothing you can do about it. You got to get your passport, and that's how you roam the earth. And that's the first piece of identity anyone's looking for, outside of how you look and present. How what is the cost of the competition today? Well, first let's talk a little bit about the disparity, which I think everybody knows. I've read a stat that the average refrigerator in the US consumes more electricity than 30 families in any random place in Africa. One family can have 5 cars here fairly easily. And over there, zero, zero to cars to not much else in here, walking and so on and so forth. And this is more about thinking about the average, right? So it's not that there aren't people, and I remember Bill Gates saying this, is they're starting to observe more similarity between middle class America, for example, and some of the upper middle class in Nigeria, for example, right? There's more of those similarities. They move about, they went to the same schools, they have the same types of lives and have just as many cars as the same. But that is still very much on the exterior points of the curve. The middle 66% are living fairly differently. Part of the cost of that is when something like COVID happens, everyone's locked down in their primary identity, your nation, where you come from. On top of that, if COVID were truly, I mean, COVID was very deadly, but if it were genuinely killing everyone who touches it, like Ebola, then you would see very uneven distribution of vaccines, in which case this limited supply of vaccines will only go to these people from these countries, and then you guys can figure yourselves out. So you could have seen everybody just wiped out generations. And that's what things like Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is fighting at the World Trade Organization, is saying the patents for these things need to not be so stringent and so expensive. And then the medicines, the drugs, whatever, it's just prohibitively high. If as a race we should be cooperating, then even if you invested 10 billion and you don't yet know how you're going to recoup that 10 billion, well, because of this emergency, we've got to make sure that like, how do you do that, right? Yeah. So I think in terms of like how those costs come to life, it's very, very, very real. And you can imagine that it is also, quote, accretive. Um, if you're not educated enough because you don't have as much energy as these other people, then, then you will never be able to make the patents for yourself. And so the thing just continues and stays that way. So, yes, to your point, this is the stuff I'm trying to get my head around and not internalize any angst or anger, or any resentment toward anyone, but more, how do you get your own power? How do you figure out a way in spite of all of the difficulty? And I remember that that moment of being in graduate school and having that exposure helped me see the stories of a China, of a Korea, and how they got themselves up from under their colonizers, Japan, and how they were able to compete with everybody else. And I remember going to Korea about last month for a wedding, and I asked my friend who's Korean, I said, what is the chip on Korea's shoulder? They just feel like a country who has something to prove in terms of just how quickly they develop, how fast they leave things that don't work and move on to what actually works. And if you think about that country, about 50 million people, every Kia and Hyundai that you have ever driven is from them. Every Korean, the barbecue, Korean barbecue, then they've got their gastro diplomacy. They have a kimchi institute across the entire country, across the United States. I've not even mentioned K-pop and the storm that one has taken. People that have never left Nigeria are doing Korean dramas on Nollywood. So so it's like, how does Nigeria, how African countries kind of come from where we are today to a place like that? The Afrobeat, the culture, all that stuff is organic, and at the end of the day, 1 million streams of music on Spotify in Sweden can probably get you $10,000 to $20,000. 1 million streams on Spotify will get you $300 in Nigeria. So we we continue to be just, and if you do not own the streaming platform, the means of distribution, well, you stay in the same place. So that's the questions. How do you break that development trap? Or how do you not break it or sidestep it? How do you get up from under the difficult situation you're in and get your power back?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. If we focus on ourselves and our growth and building excellence so that we can be competitive, what are the opportunities that you're seeing there? What are the patterns that most people are missing in terms of opportunities to collaborate?
Because I have a computer engineering background and I did a lot of social impact work, I come from what I call network theory. Um, and because I come from the computer perspective, which you can have computer networks, you can have social networks, climate is a network, the brain is its own network, they're all types of networks. And we use knowledge and information from one type of network to understand a different type of network, and so on and so forth. But because I'm looking more now, I told you what I'm trying to figure out. So I'm going to rely on the tools that I have. So what I'll do is kind of split the answer into two. So the first one is about like collaboration within the tribe. So this is more social, it's more human. And the focus now is like, if Africa is going to stand up and be somebody, how do we make that happen? My current hypothesis is density. So say you live in Nairobi and say the roads are bad or whatever, and the population is 1,000 people. The education level, the exposure levels of that group of 1,000, if there were only 30 people who are educated and exposed enough to know that the roads aren't supposed to be that way, and we just expect different, you might not see different, no matter how many years you give it. But if that population got closer to 300 out of 1,000, higher density of it, more educated, more, then you will very likely start to see people tend toward leaders who are from that 300. And, look, we need to fix the roads, we need to do XYZ. And so that's why, and one of my colleagues, Bob, um, Spore, he's late. He died about a year ago. But Bob kind of pioneered this idea of a change maker density, which we are offering to institutions to self-assess. And changers or change makers, if you will, are people who can anticipate the direction of flow and how things are going. So they're not just like, there's people who are stuck at the change, and they're stuck and they're not going to move even if you bring the change. Then there are the people who might join you on the change but don't really care. And there are people who might flow with the change and be early adopters. But what about those who can like anticipate it and then make it happen, right? And so that's the idea of change maker density, is if you just have a higher number of those people. And he got inspiration from Netflix. They had a white paper about talent density in the past, and that's where he got that from. And so I'm using this similar idea to say, if you have 1.3 billion people in Africa, what is the density, or what is the population of them who understands the West, who understand the East, who understand how the world works, who understand how the main institutions, all the Bretton Woods institutions that have such heavy influence on us, the trade organizations, the powerful billionaires, and what is the density of them that get it, and how are they oriented toward the motherland, and what is the density of people in the motherland who get it, have power, know how to deal with, and know how to essentially lead by having a new vision or a new direction, a new paradigm, so that those allies and partners around the world who want to help develop Africa can do it. So the question about collaboration then comes down to what I call paradigms or mindsets. If the ones in the West keep saying, oh, Africa is deficit this deficit, that deficit, then they're not quite going to collaborate, right, in the way that is needed. If people on the ground are saying, well, our leaders are crap and our leaders don't this, and they don't see what their leaders are going through in DC when they come here. The South Africa example is a great one. So the point about collaboration for me, and here's how I'm going about it. I've called it now the global African. But the underlying philosophy behind this idea of the global African is for people who are as African as they are global. So they may be in the global space, or they may be in Africa, but they're able to see both and they're able to make sense of what's happening. The more important piece here is that these people, A, get two major forms of capital. The first is what I've learned from anthropologists is bonding social capital. Bonding social capital is the idea that you are in an in-group, people who are similar to you, very much like you, you're safe there, and it's meant for survival, right? Um, so I do a lot of happy hours and parties and networking things so that they can meet one another 10 years before they're ever going to need. That way, if I know you as this person and I'm safe with you, I mean, when you bring a business deal, maybe we've tried 2 or 3 times in that 10-year period that didn't quite work, but now we understand each other well enough for when it will finally work. Okay. And then the second is bridging social capital. Bridging social capital is where you reach up in socioeconomic status, or you reach out to groups that are not like you, but you need them and you need their help. So my very careful task has been, how do I get enough of the most powerful people within the most powerful institutions, maybe even some people who are outside those institutions, maybe entrepreneurs, whatever. They're at a certain stage in their career. They've earned power within their institutions, but they may not quite have figured out how to bend the institution in the direction that they think it needs to go. So that's one, just collecting those people. Then the second piece is around paradigms. One Ashoka Fellow talks a lot about asset framing versus deficit framing. And the idea of asset framing is, if you talk about a black neighborhood in the US, people tend to think of violence and all these negative things. But if you talk about a black community in the US, people tend to think of food and music, and all you did was change one word, right? And so if every document the World Bank wrote started with, in Africa, they respect the elders, that's an asset that we can use. In Africa, the young people really love to have a good time. Okay, that's another asset we can use. And so, can we take more of an asset framing and build a new paradigm that says, here's how Africans self define, here's what they want? One thing that bothers me a lot, and I have been guilty to use this language in the past, Africa has the youngest population, median age 19, and it's an opportunity. Opportunity for whom? More neo slave drivers? No. But the Africans don't see themselves that way. They don't talk about themselves in that light either. Why are we doing that? So I've, in the last 6 months, come up with a new paradigm that says, make Africa the best place to be a young person. So whether we are, and the idea is that if they love living in Africa, vibes and music, nature, just connectedness, all of that, let's make this the best place for anybody, even a young Swede or a young Thai person, to be a young person. This is the best place. And if it's the best place to be a young person, chances are it is the best place to be born and raised. And it might be the best place to stay young, especially for someone like me who's starting to get the grays, right? You can stay young and you can feel great. And because Africa is this wonderful place where they respect age and people age with dignity, it's also the best place to grow old with dignity. And so that sort of framing and that sort of paradigm, think about deploying a $60 billion AI fund, which I will talk about in a moment. But if you're thinking about, oh, the AI needs to respect elders, that's just a thing that we do here. You know, it's a completely different paradigm. And you can imagine how in an AI conversation, that does not sound real or realistic or even necessary. Like, why would that even be a topic? But as an underlying idea for how you develop things, you need to be very clear. So to answer the question about um, collaborations and connections, I think the most powerful Africans around the world need to begin to find one another, and they all need to start sharing a similar paradigm around who Africa is and what it could be, and so on and so forth, and who's supposed to take the reins to do that. And I think that's where there's been a bit of a gap, or in my view, a major opportunity to actually reshape that and help individual Africans say, you've done a great job at your firm and this big institution. What would you do at this institution that would make them, you'd reach this level of respect where they're like, okay, whatever you say we should do in terms of Africa, we're gonna do. So that's the next step, and that's the next level. So that's what I'm carefully working on. Um,
Yeah. Why don't people believe the assets? I mean, this is all of what you've said to me completely makes sense. And I also think a little bit, the contrarian part of me is like, are we telling ourselves a story we believe or one that we want to believe?
I don't think it's either, Noella. I think things have been recited to us and we just stay with it. And as long as there's no language challenging it, there's no other story challenging it. This is the thing I've learned. We all live in narratives, all of us. Narratives about ourselves, narratives about our families, but there's a lot of narratives we're not aware of, but they form the basis. So, as an example, God will always take care of you. That's a narrative. It doesn't matter what you think, what you believe, just hearing that consistently is a narrative. It will always work out is another narrative, right? It's just and it's reinforced through film, through religion, through this, through this, through this. And I'm sure you've never thought to question, like, question that, right? Um, and if anything, when you look through your life and you're going through a very difficult time, you ask yourself, you know what? What I've learned is that it will always work out. That's a narrative you got from someone you've now edged to that
Yeah.
narrative. So my argument is you can form the narrative you're going to work with. You can literally create a new one, right? And decide this is what I will just always tend toward.
Yes. Yes.
And if Africans are saying Africa is the best place to be a young person and is gonna be the best place to be a young person, well then that is starts to force us in that direction. And I've seen that with the United States as well. It's always said it is an open place with freedom and anybody can come in, da, 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 such that even when the reality is not showing that, the country is still aspiring to it regardless and constantly falling short. The best thing about the US is because it's aspiring to such high ideals, even when it falls short, it ends up better than everybody else. That's the reality. It ends up way ahead of everybody else. And so that's the question. I think that's what I'm really trying to get at. Look, check the narratives you use, check the narratives you work with,
Yeah.
and then create new ones.
This is going to sound funny, but I kind of am starting to feel like, what does truth even have to do about it? We are creating narratives to replace old narratives. That's what we're doing. And I think you're going to take us to AI and the power and opportunity there for collaboration. I want to share a story about my experience with Claude. Claude really struggles with the difference between funny and cruel. And every time I try to correct through I need to get to a line edit level because no matter how I describe it, it's just, oh, okay, you're telling me to leave out some facts. I'm like, no, don't leave out some facts. Just frame it in a more affirming way. And I really haven't cracked the code of how to teach Claude kindness. So when you were telling me about AI that respects your elders, I think there's this opportunity to just to grow the parts of us that allow us to connect with and see people more clearly for the assets that they bring. And maybe we haven't done that historically, in which case LLMs that are built on our historical ways of working are not going to be the ones that support this or serve this.
Absolutely. In fact, AI that is imbued with values based AI, is a big topic of research and sort of product development. The first thing I must say is AI, generative AI, these LLMs that you're talking about, are just a small part of artificial intelligence in that sense. But I think they're what most of us know and work with. When I think about AI, I think about every other thing behind it, like the data centers that are used to manage it. So the infrastructure, right? Like the undersea cables that are used to make the connections happen, and so on and so forth. And I think in AI in general, they think about three core things: data, and the quality of the data that they use to train the AI on. Two is compute, so that you know the chips and how well can the chips work. And today, it's almost like we're trying to watch like a HD video on like a Microsoft 256 KB thing from like 10 years ago. Like that's where we are at, right? So with compute, we got to do a little bit better. And finally, the algorithms. You know, can you get more efficient algorithms that can? So those are the three things people typically think and talk about when they talk about AI. Um, Now, there's a theme that I developed about 3 or 4 years ago that I've called a braided duality. So, this idea that any tool, any technology that we develop will have a good side and a bad side. And those two things will kind of grow together, is exactly how it's likely to happen. Now, the other thing to say is that generative AI and LLMs are just pure mathematics. There are other sort of systems of AI that have been proposed in the past, like symbolic AI, which says let's not do pure mathematics, let's try and imbue AI with the ways humans actually think, something a little bit more with our heuristics, the ways we kind of think about things. Let's just dump it inside the machine. Some of the criticism there is that it's not as scalable, and so on and so forth, versus like the brute force thing. So that's why Claude, which I'm not very familiar with, could be just missing the point the whole time, right? Because it's computing things. It's not quite, understanding that okay, there's an inherent sort of value system that should constrain you within this behavior or that behavior. Yeah, there's a whole. In fact, one of my mentors who I was speaking with just 2 days ago was actually telling me about a product called Nadia, which is an AI coaching for everyone apparently, and apparently they've done a lot of work. I think the founder may have won even a Turing fellowship or something. They've been winning some awards in trying to help these generative AI tools kind of have a little bit more values based, and so on and so forth. I think the prognosis is it will get better. Absolutely will get better, I think. Um, but but the kindness piece, or the taking care of, being respectful to older people, that comes down to whether we think it's important. The last thing I'm going to say, or another way I'll put it, is this: it's mostly computer scientists that are working on AI. It should be mostly anthropologists. But technology tends to intimidate people and make them think there's no access. Meanwhile, AI, artificial intelligence, is human intelligence abstracted into some other entity. In which case, the people with the most human intelligence, who understand how we organize and how we think, should be the ones guiding how we create tools to support us. You see how it's just, yeah, but what we've always done is had the technology lead. So you put a nuclear bomb in the hands of the dictator, and then it's like, oh yeah, no, let's we need to do it the other way around. You know what I mean? Yeah, we should have thought about that first and thought, okay, do we really want to annihilate all of ourselves first, and then we figure out what we should and shouldn't build, and say, okay, you know what? Here are going to be the boundaries of nuclear fusion, right? We've got to only use it for energy, and we never use it to kill another person. So it's just, yeah, it's the same thing, and how to get humanity to do that, I think, is very difficult. So what I am proposing, if I'm proposing anything, is that we view it as a braided duality, right? It will grow, the technology will grow, but the bad will probably outpace the good very quickly. So we must then work even harder on two things: one, building good AI, um, or AI for good, and two, taking the best of humanity and embedding and imbuing in how we design, develop, and use these tools.
Yeah, it's challenging because the best of humanity is so subjective. It's challenging because competition is a very real factor in this like less strategic race, arms race, AI race, whatever you want to call it. Um, but I totally, yeah, I see that. I mean, it would be fantastic if people who understood how humans organized had more of a say in how AI behaved.
Not even a say, they directed
Mm.
it. I think that's the point. If they directed it, because these arguments that we have, they've had for decades. They've studied it, philosophy and so on and so forth. And I think what we're dealing with is collaborative competition, right? And that's not a new concept. Even the hunter gatherers realized, okay, if we don't work together, we're going to be annihilated. And that's what has morphed into politics, right? In certain contexts. So it's not like we can't do it. We know what we're doing. It's just not the people who understand it that are doing it. And that's where the
Yeah,
problem
it
is.
really speaks to what you were saying, the quote you gave about the present is a footnote in, kind of the past. We had learned all these lessons and we will learn them in different iterations until we finally get it. And I hope that soon.
Honestly, if I had my way, there'd be a world council of anthropologists and historians and political scientists who lead how how emerging technology is used. Yeah. So you can innovate, you can whatever, but here's leadership on how it must be used. In that sense. Brings me to Impact Brain, another creation I had while I was at Ashoka. One question I had had over a long time, our work together with young people, there's a constant search for impact. And the question of impact is, okay, whose version of impact matters? So if Noella at Wave and Bumi at Zest say, well, our impact is that we train them and then we place them on a job and now they're earning 40, 50% higher than their peers, and that is our version of impact as program runners. But what does the young person say about the impact? I earn more than my father now, and that's causing a lot of problems in my home. Like, whose version of impact matters? So that's what gave rise to a very theoretical idea that I called impact brain. And today I work at Ashoka. So three of us, Danny, my colleague, who now founded our Ashoka AI lab, and Ignacio, uh, who was at Cambridge, in the Cambridge Center for Digital Innovation. Um, we three kind of put together this overall thought paper about how do we really help triage which version of impact matters. It is true that Bumi and Noella, the program runners, have a vision and what they were working at, and their version of impact should also matter in the room. But his version of impact should also matter, right? Um, the fact that we might be able to solve his current sort of negative impact doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it as part of our knowledge network, as part of our knowledge systems and our understanding. That we might then know that there's a system of cause and effect where effects are kind of, we're blind to certain effects. So it's this idea of, quote, nodes in a network. And when something goes out onto the network, the effect of this thing, intervention that has gone out into the network, will hit each node in the network very differently. How do we take the feedback from the network and make sense of it? Sometimes we have to put weights on certain pieces of information, but how we allocate that weight needs to be somewhat dynamic depending on the situation. And so the paper I was writing with Professor Michael Barrett, who's also a professor at the Cambridge Judge Business School and the one who's running the Cambridge Digital Innovation, was around how AI can support collaboration in a way that we get a very clear sense of how social impact ecosystems work and, well, first, how AI will improve and enhance collaboration, etc. But also, more importantly, how we then get a better sense of how impact occurs and happens to different groups, right? And unfortunately, impact sometimes cannot be, it's not a closed system. It can be have externalities that we're not even able to trace or see. And what social scientists have done over the last couple of decades to make it a real science is try to then isolate systems. That's possible in engineering. It's very easy in engineering. This is a part, this is a subassembly, and this is a system done. But with humans who are not deterministic, his girlfriend may have had a problem and she was never part of this equation. So now we're lost. So the idea of impact brain is, can we create some type of human network supported by AI uh, that can help us make sense of ideas of impact. And so if we rate it right, we can then, yeah, it's still quite theoretical, but I think there is now, and when we set it up in 2022, we didn't have Chat GPT. I think we had only reached GPT-2 or something at the time. And we were thinking about how we might use GPT-2. But then I think Chat GPT came out a year later, or a year and a half later, 3.5. And then it's like, oh, wow, we can do so much
Yeah.
more of this. So that's what impact brain is, whose version of impact matters. And given so many, quote, beneficiaries or actors within the system, um, how do we then make sense of of impact enough to say this is for the good of all.
Mm, mm. Fascinating. Wow. Okay, so here's some assumptions that I have, and I want you to check them, and then I would love for you to walk me through an example of this working. The first one is you need the data from all of the different actors in the ecosystem. In terms of like previous examples, just what is the information that's being fed into the system so that it can kind of draw conclusions. The second thing I'm wondering about is that it is a it is a tool at the end of the day, isn't it? So if Bunmi is using it versus Bunmi's client, who is the one who's looking for a higher paid job, but there's all of these knock-on effects that the program runner, in this case Bunmi, is not aware of, you would get different outputs, is what I'm assuming. And so it's not so much there is one answer that Impact Brain gives you. It is, what is your priority? Okay, then this is how you should behave. Is that like, can you tell me your thoughts on those two things? Are my assumptions correct or not? And then also, what does success look like?
Wow, Noella, you always ask the best questions. And the thing we're asking the best questions is sometimes
Yeah,
there's no
that works
answer.
too.
So, so I don't have an answer, but I am highly inspired by the question. You are right in the assumption. In my view, the data is narratives. I want to hear from you. But the truth is, narrative at time 2021 might be different from narrative at time 2022. But that is why we set up 5-year studies to try to see, is the impact still correct, right? But the person who's running the study is needs it to move in one direction, right? Yeah, but what we want to do now is see, okay, can we get more real time data, more malleable narratives that say, here's how it's impacting me, here's how it's impacting me, here's how it's impacting me, and that's very important. It is quite this idea is quite ethereal, but it's not impossible. We were thinking a lot about how we use narratives and empower people in the community with AI that can help them with their narrative formation. So, for example, a young mother who's 22, 23 wants to become a nurse, and but from her narratives, how do we know that the reason she can't become a nurse is because she can't go to night school because the bus stops running at 8? So the actual problem is that the bus stopped running at 8. So all the grants for her to go to night school, to nursing, all the this, all those programs, is the bus that's causing the problem. So how do we even help her iterate through the narratives enough to land at that point? So that's so to your point, the input certainly is narratives, but it's the word voice, right? The voice of those who are unheard can now be bubbled up to the top. But how we do that in reality, I don't know. The second then was what does success look like? Success for me looks like a proximate leader. So in Ashoka, we talk about proximate leaders. You need to fund people who are close to the problem, who come from the problem. Because if they come from the problem and they're that wedded to whatever the problem is because they grew up in it, all the pivots and changes that are necessary in solutioning are more likely to be done than somebody who flew in, has 8 years, and then will probably leave. So we want to work with proximate leaders. So right now, what Ashoka does, which is great, is just he listens to the proximate leaders and understands their backgrounds and why they are stuck to that problem, and focuses on what they think is best for that society. But with Impact Brain, we would be able to go a layer or 2 layers and hear from different people in the community who maybe say, yeah, we've been telling him this is not how it should work ideally, right? Um, because he is great because he's able to sort of triage with people who want to help and support. So that's where he really shines. But the impact of what he's doing on balance to us is maybe 46% public benefit to us, in the way that we view it. So it then helps to kind of balance the power dynamics a little bit. and it allows people to take more ownership of their lives and their outcomes, um, and that they have. Uh, yeah. So best case scenario, that would be it. In reality, what that looks like is, for example, I'm pretty sure neither of us was in the room when the UN SDGs were being decided upon. Whoever decided them, categorized them, cataloged, and said, "This is what we're all going to move toward." The council on Earth that's deciding where to move. Um, yeah, maybe Impact Brain could be a great resource for them to be like, okay, actually, people, we're talking about quote water, but that's not how people think. People think about this, and this is what they need. Or even some paradigm shifts. Like I know in the past, philanthropies used to think about agriculture and funding agricultural value chains or whatever. Then they realize that that thinking is limited, and we need to move toward food and food systems, which is more expansive, which really takes on the entire idea, because it's at the end of the day, it's that. Looks like they've made another shift from food to nutrition and calories, because it's really about that. So as those shifts occur, can this foundation, that government person, this other people, can we all land on the same or similar set of words and paradigms, which is the whole point of collaboration? We're trying to figure out, how do we solve this problem? But if I'm talking to you about nutrition and calories, and you're talking to me about agriculture, we should be able to know that we're talking about the same thing on balance. It's just I'm in a different part of the ecosystem than you are. But what happens today is, oh no, no, we don't fund that. That's not us. And then we're done. And that's where there's a lot of these breakage. And I know I sounding like foundations, but it's the same thing with the government and their priorities and how they pick their priorities. It's the same thing with businesses and where they think the opportunities lie, and so
Yeah.
forth.
Oh, I see. I see so much potential for that and so much need for that. Even being able to say, here are the things that matter to, yeah, to the people we want to serve. And here are the things that we're not addressing right now, but we're being clear that we have acknowledged everything that matters. And this is why we're not addressing this, I think goes a long way to building trust and setting priorities. I guess I want to, I mean, there's, for me, I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I'm going to just, ask for another, and we need to have another session clearly. But for this one, I'd like to kind of ask you about you've got so many things that you're working on, and what's a question about the world right now that does keep you up at night, not in an anxious way, but in a I can't stop thinking about this way.
Apparently, the kids call that my Roman Empire. I didn't know. Yeah, it's like, oh, what's your
Mm.
Roman Empire? Apparently, yeah, apparently people on TikTok, maybe, I don't know, they talk about their Roman Empire. It's very surprising. Aside, I was in Nairobi, and they're like, yeah, um, he was her
Wow.
Roman Empire. Yeah, so
Love that.
what does that even mean? Yeah, I know, yeah, so I guess that's the thing. Um, but I think I said it at the beginning. It's what would it take for, let me start with Nigerians and scale to Africans, to come up from under the thumb of the world, because that's how it feels. It feels very powerless right now. And what would it take to regain that power? And maybe some of it is personal projection as well, right? Sometimes I feel constrained in a different country. Sometimes I feel I don't have, I certainly do not have all the money I need to make the changes I think are best. Um, and maybe not I think are best, what the best people think are best, and that's it, right? And the more you zoom out to the quote global world order, the clearer it is that people aren't acting in the best interest of the people that they claim to be working for. And so the question is, how do you devolve power way more, so that those who are quote disadvantaged and those who can't quite compete can also find their footing and also have that power. I think that was supposed to be the promise of democracy. It's, in my view, failing. And in fact, in the political science literature, democracy is not very strongly linked to development. It's not. Yeah, it's very ambiguous. There are people who argue that it is, and there are people who argue that it's not. It's not something like. There are other things that are okay. This definitely gets you there, but democracy is just not one of them. And so, what is that power devolution process that really will help an Africa turn the corner, um, on its own terms? So there are two very, very tricky things there, right? The first is not like we're not just going to do it what everyone else is doing or try to go in that direction. But the second is that we are able to also own ourselves and compete. So that definitely, you will catch me randomly thinking about that. And should I try to become a billionaire just to be able to have an influence? But then I see how even Gates can't quite have an influence to the level that he would like. So, okay, is that the best path? Do you go into politics to try to see if you can, make something happen in that regard? But the way I'm dealing with that liminal space right now is proselytizing. I have decided to just become, or to work on my voice, which is part of why I'm very grateful for this podcast. Work on my voice, work on my language that does what I know how to do best. Someone called me the king of the reframe. We just reframe the ideas. We reframe how you're thinking about it. I get so much joy when I kick away one of the assumptions that people are like, they're leaning on these assumptions, right? And like kick it down. Like it's like, oh, that's not there anymore. Okay, great. Let me help people see that they can be aware of the narratives that they're living in. And more importantly, you can have power to change the narrative. And once you can change the narrative, hopefully you start to see things differently and then operate differently. It looks like for the problems I'm trying to pursue, I'll never have enough money, but maybe I can always have collaborators. And so that's why I'm trying to build this density, this critical mass of people who have the expertise and the skills and the money and all of this, and then have them kind of coordinated and working in one.
Yeah. Storytelling, I'm big on that. And I think it is going to change the world if we tell good stories. So thank you so much, Bunmi. I enjoyed every moment of this, and we need to do it again. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show. It really makes a difference. I'm also always looking for guests who enjoy meaningful conversations. If that sounds like you, send me a message with what you'd like to talk about, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening.